Hello, Eric Walczykowski here, CEO of Bespoke Partners and host of Tailored Talent. Today, I'm joined by Rob Greenhalgh from Summit Leadership. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So talk to me a little bit about the elements of culture that you see drive outsized results.
Yeah. First of all, let me tell you, Eric, I might steal your idea about the personal statement. So thank you for that nugget. I might build that into what we do moving forward. It's a great idea. In terms of culture, again, I think sometimes when we use words like culture, people think it's like a nice to have, or they think about a bunch of wall posters or the culture that's articulated on the mug I got. But I actually agree with Peter Drucker that culture is a difference maker. And I think my personal opinion is the answer to your question really depends on what the company is trying to do. And so I think we're working with a client right now, and we're actually creating their leadership framework, something about like their leadership model. Probably the most famous company that has a book around it, and the whole thing is Amazon and the Amazon principles. So this company said, hey, we really want to codify our culture. So, one of the problems we were trying to solve is that tribal knowledge was the way that people learned there, but it wasn't consistent around the firm. And so what I like about a leadership model or a set of leadership principles is when it's linked very closely to the kinds of behaviors that are required to drive a strategy. Right. So if you think about a company that's really innovative and needs to think outside of the box, needs to fail fast, those kinds of things, you're going to want to make sure that in a leadership model, those behaviors really come out. If you're working with an organization that's all about cost and cost cutting, that's a different set of behaviors to do that. And so, there's a lot of off-the-shelf generic leadership models. And, when you look at organizations, probably 70% of behaviors are the same across companies. But it's that last 30% that really make the difference about the kinds of behaviors that team members at all levels should be demonstrating to drive the strategy. In terms of your question about outsized returns, this is my personal campaign that I'm on. Agility and adaptability. We live in this world today. This is a term that was coined by the military years ago, VUCA. So volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And we are living in a highly VUCA world these days. And so I think that for any high growth company, the ability to be agile, which means the ability to learn from experience, to apply the right learnings to new situations, to be in touch with what's happening outside of the firm, what's happening in the marketplace, and how is that evolving. And I'll say, I think the money behavior is openness to feedback from one another, feedback from the market. And it's a combination of those things that allows individual leaders and organizations to be agile. And I think that if you're not agile today, you're not going to be around for very long.
No, absolutely. I love what you said about the learnings. It's really interesting. I've done 6 founder transitions. And what I found in a number of the founder transitions is you have a organization that's built to please the founder to succeed. And what happens a lot in those high performance culture is when a mistake happens, all hell breaks loose. And it's like, no, you can't do this. And I've many times inherited an organization that's afraid to make mistakes, which to me is the opposite of being agile and innovative, because what ends up happening is they'll work to death to try to fix the mistake before anybody finds out. And what I often do is I turn the organization around. I said, hey, if we're not making mistakes, we're not moving and innovating fast enough. And so when you make a mistake, the first thing to do is raise your hand and shout from the rooftops, I need help. And as soon as that happens, then you swarm. And then the second thing is we do an after action review, which then it shouts from the rooftops, hey, these were the things we learned in these mistakes. And what ends up happening when you have key leaders do that is it just proliferates through the organization. But I think that oftentimes people are afraid to make mistakes in organizations, which leads to a lack of agility, which you mentioned there.
I think what's interesting as well is how many organizations say we encourage innovation and risk taking, but then punish the people who make mistakes, right? Like we see that all the time. I don't know if you know Adam Grant. He's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and I like him because he talks about the space of work and leadership, and he has a very provocative definition of culture, which has always resonated with me a lot. And his definition of culture is the worst behavior that's tolerated in your organization. And what he's trying to point out there is like, we can talk about what we want our culture to be. We can have a set of leadership principles, but if there is, bad behavior, for example, punishing people who make mistakes, and that's tolerated, that's really what your culture is, as much as you want to articulate it being something else. So I think culture to me all comes down to behaviors. And so you got to figure out what are the right set of behaviors to drive whatever your strategy is. But then it's, you have to reinforce that and you have to celebrate that. And if you start behaving in ways that are inconsistent with your espoused culture, that's what makes life very confusing for team members.
And that really gets to what I believe is integrated talent management. And the system we use is this notion of attract. How do we attract the very best people? How do we develop them? How do we create a sense of belonging so that people are gelling in this ecosystem really well on the value creation plan, which then leads to outsized retention? And that's this holistic talent model, which I think we're still at our infancy in private equity. And I start to think about what do we need to do to up-level the industry here? And I think it really starts with the private equity firms having a talent thesis ecosystem that's holistic, not just how do I recruit the best teams. And then I also think we need to look at the people function within these portfolio companies and how do we up level that whole system, turning from historically HR being a blocking and tackling to a strategic weapon, and potentially the most strategic weapon in the company. Wouldn't you agree?
100% agree with that. The idea of taking it from personnel, remember in the old days, they used to call it the personnel department, to strategic HR. I mean, the businesses that we're engaging with most of the time are people is really their most important asset. And I mean that very genuinely. It's not just a nice thing to say. And so if people really are the most valuable asset in terms of driving value in the business, why wouldn't we be focusing on developing that talent? And, when I think about what leadership development is, and this is kind of an aha I had in my early consulting days, is leadership development is really just a fancy term for behavioral change. And when we really think about, okay, someone is at this place in their journey right now, the business is evolving, and this person maybe hasn't operated at that scale before, hasn't had a certain set of experience, then what we really want to think about is when we think about development, because I'm also very much a believer in very practical development, I do believe that the most powerful leadership development is experiential.
Yep.
And as somebody who has an MBA and all that kind of, I believe in education, but at the end of the day, first of all, I probably remember 5% from my MBA. Secondly, it's again, the way that you become more agile and you learn from experience is to have experiences. And so we need to give people these kinds of experiences, and then where the coaching piece layers on, and I'm not talking, we do executive coaching, but even just day-to-day, like managerial coaching, is the one recognize the most important learnings from the experiences they're having, and then how to apply them in different situations. That's where the agility piece kicks in. Is you have to build it into the way that we evaluate people. So when it comes to performance management, it's really around your, business results are obviously very important, but how you do it aligned with whatever your articulated culture is really important. How do you look for people, right? I mean, I think that employees, even before they're employees, are already going to experience your culture from the very first phone call they have from a recruiter. And you guys are in the industry, so you guys know that.
Yep.
And so it's about like defining it, articulating it, and communicating it, and then most importantly, reinforcing it. And I find that like where culture isn't accompanying organizational growth is where, the rollout of a culture, the articulation of a culture, these one-off events, a town hall from time to time. But when it's not part of the actual operating system of the company, then it becomes like a nice to have, but it's not actually having an impact in terms of performance.
Well, look, I mean, we're in the business of attracting talent. And that first exposure is so important. I mean, one of the things I do in my company still to this day, I'm proud to admit it, I meet with everybody we hire before we do it. And we're 100 plus people now. I've done that in an organization that was 1,000 people, just because I think it's so important. And I literally have one question. I said, look, I'm not part of your interview committee, but I just want to really understand that you understand our culture and what you're getting yourself into, because we all have choices, and I want to make sure that you make a good choice in this. And I have them articulate the culture to me and then share some thoughts and go through that. Rob, this was a wealth of information. I'd love to connect in person, but thanks for joining today, and thanks for being a great partner at Summit. The work you do is very valuable to our ecosystem, and look forward to doing more of it together.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and really appreciate the collaboration as well. So thank you, and we'll talk soon.